Well, we are very pleased today to be sitting here with President Jimmy Carter, who's the author of a brand new book called A Remarkable Mother. Thank you so much for joining us today, President Carter.
I'm delighted to be with you and with Borders.
Miss Lillian was such an enigmatic figure, such an extraordinary woman. And the book, on its face, is definitely a biography, a story about an extraordinary woman and her family. This is also a story about a woman who redefined herself and who found a way to live adventurously all throughout her life, but especially in her middle life.
Well, Mama was an indomitable character, and she tried to devote every day of her life to doing exciting and interesting and adventurous and unpredictable and gratifying things. And she was strong-willed enough not to worry about public criticism or even the loss of some friends. And she would tackle the most controversial and important events or problems in society in an incredible fashion. For instance, she saw when I was a little child in an isolated community where we only had black neighbors, no white neighbors, that the ravages of racial segregation that had been in place then for almost 100 years should be ended. And so she just set out on her own to disavow any legal constraints, even though the Supreme Court of the United States and the Congress and all the churches and all the schools said racial segregation is the law of the land. She said it doesn't apply to me.
And that was especially difficult in the South, obviously.
Oh yeah, and we were in the deepest part of a deep South. And so she did that, and that was a characteristic of her life all the way through until she was 70 years old. She was in the Peace Corps in India, still dealing with disadvantaged people who were untouchables mostly, suffering from leprosy and so forth. She was over there, once again, giving everything she had as a registered nurse to try to help those people have a better life.
Yeah, and the first part of the book is really a story of a small town life, frankly. It's your mother, Lillian, who met Earl, and they're coming together and they're starting a family. And your father, Earl, was a strong character as well. But your mom really found a really strong voice as a wife and as a mother at a time when you said that Southern matriarch, or that strong female matriarch, was such an integral part of that sort of post-Civil War era.
It was, because so many of the men were killed during the Civil War, so that meant that their widows survived and they had to be head of the family. So there was a kind of a custom then, even much later when I came along, not to exalt women who were independent and strong-willed and in some ways dominant. So it was a special characteristic of some Southern women. Mother continued that. Her parents knew the Reconstruction days, and they remembered what happened after the Civil War. Mm-hmm. My grandfather, her father, talked about it a lot. But Mother inherited some of that privilege, I would guess, for a Southern woman to be exceptionally strong. And she was blessed in many ways to be a registered nurse, because being a part of the medical profession gave her some degree of ability to withstand, to be impervious to condemnation, because she reached out to blacks and treated them as equals all her life.
You talk in the book about the storytelling that you'd have in front of the fire and how important books were to your family and to your mother especially.
She read constantly. In fact, she started a habit, which my wife and I still have, and I think all my kinfolks have, of reading it at the table, because she didn't want to waste those precious hours just eating food. So she would read at the table, and my daddy didn't much approve, but she would get permission from my daddy for us children also to read at the table. So my wife and I do the same, and our children did, which precipitated a lot of arguments or debates while we were eating meals. So we would read some provocative thing in a newspaper or magazine or a book, and then we would start an argument about it. So we debated with each other, and that's one thing that kind of introduced us to the political world.
You say too in the book that when you were reading, your mother said everything was cool, you didn't have to be working or doing anything else, so you all read a lot. You know?
We did, that's true. My daddy was a very stern disciplinarian. When Daddy gave a command or laid down a rule, we were expected to follow it. And if we didn't, we were severely punished, which was a custom in those days. I got 5 major whippings while I was growing up, and I remember all of them. Mother would see me or my sisters commit some so-called crime while during the day, and so she would hasten to give us a very mild punishment So when my daddy came home later in the day, she would say, Jimmy did so-and-so, but Earl, I've already punished him. She did not punish him, so she tried to protect us from my daddy.
Absolutely. Well, in 1953, though, your dad passed away.
He did.
And that marked a changing point in your mother's life.
And in mine, yes.
You came back to Plains
I
with
came
Rosalind.
back after my daddy died, and so from 1953 on, I never knew but one parent. I was 16 years old when I left home. I was in the Navy about 12 years. So mother, when I was even an adult, a young adult, an ex-naval officer, she really helped shape my life. But she did blossom forth.
After your father died, obviously she's just starting to now feel her way into this new life. She decides to spend 8 years as this fraternity house mother with a bunch of raucous college kids.
That's true.
That's just an unusual choice right there. You must have known right at that moment that your mother was going to take a new path.
Well, I did. Mother was well off enough. My dad left her money enough so she could buy a new automobile every 2 years, and she bought a Cadillac. So she would take her new Cadillac over and turn it over to those boys, 96 of them,
right,
to use any way they wanted to. And then when they tore it up or wore it out, she would get a new one. And so she really treated all of those boys as her own children. I used to accuse her of caring more about them than she did her real children. But if they got in trouble of any kind, instead of going to their parents to confess that their girlfriend was pregnant or that they had violated the university rules or got caught cheating on an exam, they would come to my mother, and she was their, in real terms, she was not only their house mother, she acted as their loving parent.
Yeah, and you say in the book that for to the end of her life, some of these Kappa Alpha brothers would come seek out Miss Lillian and find her just to say hello and reconnect. That's a wonderful story.
And I was always surprised to see they were still out of jail.
Yeah.
But they did quite well.
Absolutely. Well, she had a good effect.
She did that.
You know, your mother had a fun spirit too to her. She was a huge baseball fan. Was that the very first baseball game that Jackie Robinson played in?
Yeah, she and my father went on one vacation a year. It was after we laid by our crop. That means we got past the point we had to plow the crop, and before harvest season, so they had time off. And they would go each year for 2 weeks to a baseball town, to St. Louis or to Cincinnati or to Chicago or to Boston, New York or Philadelphia, somewhere, wherever they had major baseball. And they would stay 2 weeks. And at that time, the teams weren't moving around the nation like they do now with airplanes.
Right.
So they stayed at home for a good while. And they didn't have any night games. So they could watch maybe a doubleheader baseball game and then be free that evening to go out on the town. So that was a very delightful vacation. And she knew about the upcoming prowess of Jackie Robinson. He was from Georgia, by the way, not too far from my hometown. So she and my daddy were there the first game he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And so she adopted the Brooklyn Dodgers as her fan, as her team, the rest of her life. So when Ted Turner bought the Braves, I would quite often sit in Ted Turner's owner's box, and my mother would go with me when they played the Dodgers. She would scream for the Dodgers. She had one of the most raucous voices. You could hear her all over the stadium. Yeah. And either before the game or afterwards, every Dodger player would come by and give my mother a love and a hug and a kiss. And then, of course, Tony Lasorda would come by also.
Right.
And then when I got to be president later, my mother had Tony Lasorda's telephone number, which I'm sure he regretted, and she watched all of the Dodger games, even on the West Coast, to a television antenna. And she would call Lasorda after the games and give him a piece of her mind if he did something that she didn't like. She had a lot of interesting experiences. And then later she was a great admirer of Muhammad Ali. And it's hard to remember then, but he was condemned in this country very severely during the Second World War, during the Vietnam War, because he was a draft dodger, and he was also a Muslim. And so now he's looked on almost universally as a great favorite, but then he was really condemned by many people. My mother adopted him, maybe because of that, so she abandoned me and my campaign for running for president one time to go to New Orleans to see him fight for the heavyweight championship.
All through this book, you tell these wonderful stories of your mother, these stories of her loving all my children and these pro wrestling and the Dodgers. Along the way, your career is growing. Now, as you're reading this book, it was hard to tell where you were in your career. You did make some minor references to your career, and you could draw some of those parallels. This really is a book about your mother.
Yeah.
It was hard to sort of discern as you read it where you are in this book.
Well, she played a role when necessary. When I started running for president, we had Amy, who was only 5 years old. And so we asked Mama to do her share by keeping Amy. And after a few months, so Mother got impatient with that and decided she wanted to go on the campaign trail also. Mm-hmm. So then we turned Amy over to Rosen's mother, also in Plains, all of us from Plains. And so Mother went on the campaign trail, and she campaigned actively for me 5 days a week, every week,
right,
for months and months. And she was so provocative and attractive in her speaking way and her irrepressible spirit that she got me a lot of support. She and Rosalind were the two secret weapons. So by the time my opponents woke up, they had already lost the election.
Yeah. Your mother was always very much into politics. I mean, you talk about, you know, going back before these folks, but Hubert Humphrey and then Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Kennedy and later Andrew Young that she sent some money to when he was an up-and-coming politician. Clearly, she was an active person, really engaged in politics. In fact, in some cases, she said that she listened to those politicians more than you.
Well, that's true. She listened to Andrew Young more than she did me, and maybe Hubert Humphrey as well. Not many people know it, but the founder of the Peace Corps was actually Hubert Humphrey. John Kennedy got credit for it because he happened to be president when the legislation passed. Mm-hmm. So Mama admired Hubert Humphrey for the Peace Corps, and he singled Mama out for special attention while she was in India.
Yeah. What would your mother think of this presidential election that we're going through right now with Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and John McCain?
I think she would be exhilarated to see the possibility, likelihood maybe, of a black man or white woman being elected president. And I think she would look with favor on John McCain, because I was a Navy man, he was a Navy man, he was in prison. I admire him too.
Still peacekeeping here.
Still peacekeeping, I think so.
I'm talking
I am.
about.
Well,
yeah.
I try to
Reaching
be.
across the aisle.
But, you know, Rosa and I decided when I left the White House that we wouldn't publicly endorse, you know, in any of the Democratic candidates. We don't get involved directly in the primary campaign because we're overseas and everything a lot. And so we won't make a public decision until after the primary season's over, and we're approaching the convention, and then we'll make a choice.
Mm-hmm. Well, that part about your mother going to the Peace Corps is to me the most inspiring part of this book. Mostly because you can follow your mother through the series of letters, some of which you put in here and other stories that we heard from some of the other participants, how she evolved as a person. She had already taken steps, to your point, to reach out and to give back to the world. But when she went, there was a point where she wasn't sure she was going to stay. It was very difficult for her.
She was quite disillusioned because Mama asked to go to any place that was poverty-stricken and where the people had dark skin. So they sent her to India, and she began to learn at the University of Chicago, right here, as a matter of fact, how to speak Hindi. She thought she was going to New Delhi and be a nurse. But Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who was the Prime Minister of India, ordained at that time a very strict family planning program. So instead of coming to New Delhi, Mother was sent down near Bombay to a little village called Vikhroli. And instead of nursing sick people, she was put in charge of imposing very strict family planning regulations on those poverty-stricken, untouchable people.
But her roles expanded while she was there, and what's the most inspiring part, I think, about the book is to see how your mother began to understand that while maybe she couldn't change the world, that those that she came in contact with, she could directly affect, and she could improve the lots of everyone that she touched. And
yeah, that's a very wise thing to say.
There's stories of you sending gifts to her, and she passed them on to other people, and she would say, "This is great, I'm passing it on to someone else, and you should know that you've made two people happy, me and the person who I'm passing it on to."
She would literally give all of her food away. She was constantly hungry, and she would write us letters about how hungry she was. So we would send her peanut butter, you know, and different kind of canned vegetables, but she gave it all away. And she wasted away when she finally came home from the Peace Corps, and when we met to meet her at the airport in Atlanta, she couldn't walk. They had to bring her out in a wheelchair. She had lost 35 pounds, and she was already thin when she went. But Mama became finally, in her spare time, after her normal working duties, she began to help a doctor in a local clinic. And so eventually she became so invaluable to him that the owner of the village, Mrs. Godrich, let her transfer from family planning to nursing. So then Mother took care of lepers and others that had terrible diseases, and she was in her glory. She thought it was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to her.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a picture, there's a wonderful picture in this book of your mother and a young girl, a girl that she helped teach while she was in India.
This was a daughter of the gardener in that village who worked for the rich folks. And he would sneak vegetables and give them to my mother so she could cook them in her little apartment. And she didn't have any way to repay the gardener. And so she decided, she didn't have any money, so she decided that she would teach his little girl, 6 years old, how to read and write in English and get her started on an education. Very few of those very poor people had a chance to get educated. There was a lot of illiteracy there. So she taught the little girl, and the gardener took a photograph of my mother sitting on a rock teaching his little daughter. 2 years ago, we went back to India, my wife and I did, to build habitat houses. We built 100 homes near Bombay. I picked out a place where my mother had been in the Peace Corps, and we met the rich folks that owned the city, still, the town, and they brought this little girl in to meet me in Roseland. And she was obviously now a grown woman. She had gone on to get a doctorate, and she was the president of a university.
And it was the young girl.
And it was that same young girl, and that was the kind of impact my mother had on other people.
And she probably had no idea of the people that she was touching along the way.
No, she didn't.
Yeah.
She didn't.
How has your mother, and all that she did, and especially in her second half of her life, how has that affected you and all the work that you've done with the Carter Center and with everything else, Habitat for Humanity?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that that my whole family, including me, has been affected by my mother, including even my grandchildren, one of whom went to the Peace Corps because my mother had done so. But I think, I'm not bragging about it, but I think I derived from my mother a sense of human rights as she treated the civil rights movement when I was a child. When I became governor and made my inaugural address, she was sitting on the reviewing platform, and I made an announcement that I had traveled throughout Georgia, maybe more than any other candidate, and I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over. And that put me on the front cover of Time magazine a couple of weeks later. And when I became president, she was on the reviewing stand, and I announced that human rights would be the basic foundation for our foreign policy. And I don't think there's any doubt that those statements and my attitude were shaped at least partially by the example that my mother set.
Yeah. Well, not only that, she's now setting an example through this book for women looking for another adventure in their life.
I think so. Anybody that thinks that their life is over when they get older, or anyone who's afraid of criticism if they do the right thing, or anyone who's searching for a way to put into practical use their religious beliefs, I think we'd get a lot out of this book, because my mother set an example. Not trying to set an example, but just that was the way she was. She was a Christian, and she didn't preach. She tried to put into practical terms her faith. She worshiped the Prince of Peace, so she tried to promote peace. She believed in humility and justice and service and helping people who were despised and alienated from society, reaching out to them especially. She believed in compassion and love for people that maybe don't even deserve to be loved. So I think in many ways she exemplified not only what religious faith ought to bring into a person's life, but also what it means to be a great American. Now, she did become famous when I was president, but just on an isolated farm, on a little tiny community in South Georgia, she tried to be a great American. She tried to exemplify the moral values that made our country great. And that's really why I wrote the book at this late date after she has passed away, was because there's some uncertainty now in society. What can I do as an individual human being to correct the mistakes that society is making, and can I do it just by myself if I'm going to be criticized for going contrary to custom? So I thought that my mother's example might be helpful.
Well, there's no doubt about that. I think that the people who read this book are going to find a role model And we're all so happy here at Borders that you decided now, so many years later, but still such a relevant subject, to write this book. Thanks so much for joining us today, President Carter.
Hey,
nice
President.
to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's good to be with you.
Good to be with you too. Thanks.
I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, and I am an admirer of Jimmy Carter.
I'm from Chicago, and I'm also an admirer of Carter. I think he did great things during his administration, and it's just great to be able to come out here and see him and get the book signed today.
I'm a big fan of his, and all the things that he has said about his mother is pretty remarkable.
We have great admiration for President Carter, and it's a wonderful opportunity, and this is for my mother.
Having a good time. Glad that President Carter's here.
I'm very excited to be here to meet President Carter, or former President Carter. This will be the first president I've ever met, so this is exciting.
I'm here just because my mom really appreciates Jimmy Carter, and I thought it'd be a great Mother's Day present. And it's probably the closest I'll ever get to a president. I'm really excited.
I went up to the mountain because you asked me to. Up over the clouds to where the sky